There we go. Okay, so hello everyone. Um, Thank you so much for coming. My name is Brian Goggin. I'm the farm manager at Eastern Charlotte Waterways. Thanks for joining our second webinar in our series, Here We Grow. And these webinars have been made possible by RBC, and all of the wonderful speakers for these events are Food for All New Brunswick community food mentors. So thank you to everyone who helped make this a reality. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. So this webinar is being recorded, and after the series is complete, we'll be making all of them publicly available. And after today, there are 2 more webinars in the series. So if you haven't registered and you're interested, I'm going to post the link to register in the chat. You all should be able to use the chat function, and you should also be able to unmute yourselves if you have questions at the end of the webinar. And now I'm going to ask that everyone puts their name into the chat so we can keep track of who's attended. Because if you do attend the next 2 webinars, then you are eligible to be entered into our prize draw to win either a home hydroponic growing system or a VegPod garden stand. So the purpose of the series is to increase our knowledge on growing and preserving and finding local food. And we thought that it would be a great way to kick off the launch of our indoor aeroponic farm, which will be located in Blacks Harbor, New Brunswick. The indoor farm will use 50 aeroponic towers to grow a variety of leafy greens, herbs, and microgreens in its initial phases. And this is ECW's way of bringing fresh and nutritious food to our community through controlled environment agriculture, while giving life to an old community asset in Blacks Harbor. So controlled environment agriculture, or CEA, is a term that applies to all agricultural methods that regulate or control environmental variables like temperature, humidity, and the amount of light that a plant crop perceives. And this applies to many different types of agriculture like greenhouse farming or indoor farms like the one we are setting up. And CEA, controlled environment agriculture, has been proposed as a way to strengthen New Brunswick's food security by extending growing seasons and allowing for crop growth during the winter months so that we can increase the amount of food that we grow locally and year round. And this is needed because only 8% of the vegetables that we consume in New Brunswick are grown here. And having more local options overall strengthens our food system and decreases the reliance that we have on imports while avoiding the associated shipping costs. And those are the monetary costs and the environmental costs to shipping. So with that, we'll move on to our speaker today, Karrie Bedford, who will be telling us about food security and sovereignty and local food procurement. Karrie is a registered dietitian with a background in coordination and community development, education, food security, health and nutrition, and local food procurement. So at the end of the webinar, we'll be doing a question and answer period. So hold on to your questions for then, or you can put them in the chat as the presentation goes. So I think that's it, and I will share my screen for Karrie. Go. How's that?
Looks good on my end, Brian. Thank you for the warm introduction. So like Brian mentioned, my name is Karrie Bedford. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you all. And just again, thank you for registering. It's nice to see so many like-minded folks and see where we're all joining in from today on the chat. So just on the next slide, we'll take a peek, as Brian mentioned, for food security, food sovereignty, and our food deserts, and what does that all mean, and where does NB stand? So just before I get started, I wanted to cover some acknowledgements, disclosures, and some disclaimers. So just that my opinions expressed in this presentation are mine and mine only, so they don't necessarily reflect the opinion of others. Also, this presentation should not be reproduced in full or without part, but it will be, as Brian mentioned, recorded and made available publicly through ECW. And then I have no other conflicts or interests to disclose. The other piece is that I encourage you all to get comfortable this evening and take in the information presented by appreciating that for most, we are doing so from a settler's perspective. I also encourage you to have an open mind and consider the wisdom that's been shared from our Indigenous elders throughout the presentation. So, a little bit about me, just on our next slide. Perfect. So, Brian mentioned I am a dietitian. Most of my work has been focused on food across the lifespan. So, I first started my career in long term care, working with special care homes in the province and supporting food services with nutritional clinical goals. Eventually, transitioned into community nonprofits, working for Meals on Wheels and the work of many poverty reduction as part of social inclusion networks. So I'm currently working within Anglophone West School District, and I hold a part-time role as our regional resiliency coordinator for Region 11, which is the capital region. Overall, my path has really taken me on a journey focused on community advocacy work, of which have, of course, have all centered around things food. So um, to note, Brian mentioned that I was a CFM, community food mentor. I actually took my training around 5 years ago now in Perth Andover, and there was probably 10 to 15 of us in that class. And I use this information and the skills learned from this training every single day, both in my personal and various professional hats that I wear. I was so excited when ECW reached out. Through those connections, so through the Community Food Mentors website. So I encourage you guys to take a peek. And my goal this evening is to share with you a glimpse into food security in New Brunswick and how we can improve access, procurement, and overall food sovereignty. And I also encourage you to keep the chat moving. So if there's anything that comes up, I'm keeping an eye, but I think it's good to be able to kind of discuss amongst our peers. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with a question that we can plant in the chat just to reflect on this question. So, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you measure your knowledge area around food security? So, 5 being, you eat, sleep, breathe food security, and 1 being, just hearing about it now or might not know much. So, if you want to pop some of those numbers in the chat, I'd love to get a pulse. All right. Some threes, some fours. Perfect. So, we're in the right spot. This is great. Thank you for that. Our chat is working. So, just to go back over kind of what we'll chat about throughout the presentation on our agenda, um, I'm hoping to be able to dig into the terminology pieces, get it kind of go back to what's the relevance of food security, what has been done to date, what can we do, what can you do as an individual, and then hopefully bring us back together around some discussion and a Q&A period. So Brian, if you could just go forward 2 slides, perfect. So if we dig into the definition, so what does it mean to be food secure? Food security is the ability of all people at all times to have access to nutritious, safe, affordable, and culturally appropriate food that is managed in an environmentally and socially responsible way. So, although food insecurity was initially understood to be a food problem, with more research, it has become clear that the deprivation experienced by households that are food insecure is not only confined to food. So, food insecure households compromise spending across broad range of necessities, including housing and prescription medical costs, as an example. So, what does it mean to be food insecure? And so, simply, it's the inability to acquire or consume an adequate diet, quality, or sufficient quantity of food in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that one will be able to do so. Household food insecurity is often linked with households' financial ability to access adequate food, and put to simply, it's inadequate or insecure access of food due to financial constraints. Okay, so we've gone through the definition. How common is food insecurity? So on the next slide, you'll be able to see a glimpse of kind of what it looks like worldwide and yet on a national level. So unfortunately, food insecurity could happen to anyone, and it is a worldwide issue. So if you're familiar with our social development goals, its number two social development goal is to achieve zero hunger by 2030. So it's an issue worldwide that we're working to help deplete. The number of people affected by hunger globally rose to as many as 828 million in 2021, an increase of about 46 million since 2020, our pandemic, and 150 million since the outbreak of COVID. So, and this is according to the United Nations report that provides fresh evidence that the world is moving further and further away from its goal of ending hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in all forms by 2030. So, our clock is ticking. Nationally, on the right hand side here, you can see that our rates on across the country. You'll see that the territories were not available, and that's because at the time of the publication, the information wasn't there. Um, However, to reflect, in 2020, 46.1% of people in Nunavut, 23.1% of people in the Northwest Territories, and 15.3% in the Yukon lived in moderately or severely food insecure households. And in 2021, as you can see here, 15.9% of households in the 10 provinces experienced some level of food insecurity during the 12-month period. So it affects everybody across the board. 2.4 million households, 5.8 million individuals, 1.4 million being those under age 18, so our children and youth. So that means that 19.6 of our percent of our children under 18, which works out to be 1 in 5, lived in households that experienced food insecurity. So just reflecting on that number, 1 in 5 kids. And then if we look closely over here at the Maritimes, specifically New Brunswick, you'll see that I don't know if it's an award that we want, but we are the top province for food insecurity amongst our Maritimes. So I believe in years past, Nova Scotia was leading that, and our numbers have since grown to surpass what Nova Scotia's numbers reflected. So I talked a little bit about where the numbers were. So if we look to see what our trends have been, so on the next slide, um, you'll see, and you can probably guess that our rates have only worsened. So looking back at 2017 data, food insecurity is a serious problem across the country. But the rate is much, much higher in Nunavut than elsewhere. So in 2017, to 2018, 57% of households in Nunavut were food insecure. 23% experienced severe food insecurity, and rates of food insecurity were also somewhat higher in other territories, maritime provinces compared with central and western Canada. However, in no province or all below 1 in 10. So our 1 in 10 number comes back. So if we look ahead to our next slide, we're wondering, what have we done to address the issue so far? And so they've changed some of the food insecurity monitoring, but really the data we've had to go off of has been our food bank usage. And so that's kind of been our reference point to measure problems of hunger in Canada. So food banks were the first response to supporting food insecurity, and they remain our only direct response to this problem. However, as you can see here in the graph that's presented, at most 1 in 4 food insecure households actually uses a food bank. So going to a food bank is a strategy of last resort, most commonly used by experiencing severe food insecurity. But even among this group, the majority aren't using our food banks. Um, the other piece to this is that our systems of food banks are not set up to meet the need. So they also have limited capacity to meet the needs of the food bank users at the rate that's presented. And often coping with food insecurity and related hardships are commonly centers for personal strategies. So people will likely be seeking financial help from friends or family or miss bills so that they can put food on the table. So that's what we've been doing to this point. One definition that I did want to highlight, if we head over to the next slide, if we're looking at food security, one piece that we're seeing worldwide, and it impacts at urban and rural settings across the board, or what we refer to as food deserts. So, what is a food desert? Um, Basically, to summarize, they're neighborhoods where residents have little or no access to stores, restaurants that provide healthy, affordable foods. Um, so since actually World War II, our grocery stores in most of the cities have increased in size, relocated to suburban areas, leaving many neighborhoods without fresh outlets for or outlets for fresh, affordable staples like produce, milk, meat, and other things. So the effect of a food desert is significant for many low-income residents, those who often don't own a car, or perhaps also depend on public transportation if it's available. So many of low income residents frequently need to make shelter a budget priority, of course, and also have little money to spend on the food after they pay for the housing or transportation cost of actually getting their food to their plate. So we'll take a little bit to kind of reflect on, what does that food desert mean? So I encourage you to post in the chat my next question. So how many of you live within 30 minutes of a grocery store or food sources that provide staples like fresh fruit and vegetables, milk, meat, or other staples? All right, I'm seeing a lot of I do's, yes, live close. Now, the other piece that we'll come back to is thinking of actually going to get those staples. How many of you are able to take independent transportation to get your food? So if you own, some of us own multiple vehicles in our families. All right. So my point to this is that, like I mentioned earlier, many of us are coming from a point of privilege, and thinking of different scenarios where this may not be the case for some community members. So I encourage you to think of these scenarios. So imagine a frail older woman who has to carry a heavy shopping bag for many blocks on icy sidewalks. A single father who has to load all of his kids on the bus with a load of groceries as well. A newcomer who buys only enough food to cover her kids' lunches because they've had to pay for a cab to get their food. And so, understandably, in those situations that don't have access to independent sources of getting their food staples, um, people opt for closer to home alternatives. So think of your local corner stores, different fast food restaurants. Oftentimes, those geographical constraints they can impact our dietary choices and the environment. Ultimately, that the likelihood of being food insecure may increase, and it also increases the likelihood of chronic disease because what's available may not be fresh or as nutritious as what some may be able to get if they were driving elsewhere. Okay, so then one more definition that we'll dig into um, is the concept of food sovereignty. So just on the next slide, you'll see on the right hand, you'll see the 7 pillars of food sovereignty that we'll go through, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into that definition. So food sovereignty is the right to healthy and a culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So, what's the difference? I've talked about food security, food deserts, and now food sovereignty. So, I like to think of it this way: think of food security as the goal, while food sovereignty describes how we're going to get there. And they do differ in some key ways. So, food sovereignty is rooted in grassroots food movements. It highlights the need for a democratic food system, one that involves inputs from citizens as well as our producers. And food security is concerned with the protection and distribution of existing food systems. So on the right hand side, like I mentioned, you'll see kind of the seven pillars of what makes up food sovereignty. So we'll go through them briefly. Number one is that we're putting the focus on food for people, putting people's needs for food at the center of all of our policies. Insist that food is more than just a commodity. There's always a connection there with people. Number two, builds knowledge and skills. So, builds on our traditional knowledge, uses research to support and pass this knowledge to future generations. So, we have that information to pass on. It also rejects technologies that undermine or contaminate our local food systems. Number three, we want to be able to work with nature. So, optimizes the contributions of our ecosystems and overall improves resilience. Four, it values our food providers, so supports sustainable livelihoods and respects the work of all of our food providers. Five is it localizes our food systems, reduces the distance between food providers and consumers, rejects dumping and inappropriate food aid, and resists dependency on remote and unaccountable corporations. And number six, puts control locally. So it's putting it right at the source, placing control in the hands of local food providers, recognizes the need to inhabit and share territories, and rejects the privatization of natural resources. And the final piece of number seven is recognizing that food is sacred. It recognizes that food is a gift of life and not to be squandered. And it asserts that food cannot be commodified. So, reflecting on those pieces and reflecting to where we're at now or where you may source some of your food, it's good to kind of do a little bit of compare and contrast in that concept. So, overall, on the next slide, what does this all mean and why does it all matter? So, food insecurity, as I mentioned, has a serious implication for people on people's health and well-being, far beyond what poor nutrition and diet. It affects us at all levels, from individual to impacts seen worldwide. The health consequences of food insecurity put a large burden on our healthcare system and are costly for many of our public healthcare budgets. As an example, adults in food insecure households are more likely to be admitted into acute care for a wide array of reasons, and they also will stay in hospital for longer and are more likely to be readmitted if they're not nourished. Um, but we also know that food insecurity is an income problem. It's not just food. Apologize for the dog in the background. Food insecurity is more about um, not having enough food. It's not, or food insecurity is unrelated to knowing about healthy eating, food budgeting, or the local food environment. Rather, the food access problems that define household food insecurity indicate a deep level of material deprivation. Food insecure households spend significantly less food, secure households on everything. So it's not just food, but also housing, clothing, other necessities. Individuals and families that are food insecure are more likely to have inadequate and insecure incomes, to have precarious employment, and to live in insecure substandard housing, and are likely to not fill their drug prescriptions, all due to cost. So, looking at our SDG goals by 2023, It's recognizing that our sustainable development is how we must live today if we want a better tomorrow. And by meeting present needs without compromising the chances of future generations to meet their needs. And really, it's the survival of our societies and our shared planet that depends on a more sustainable world. So overall, it is really a bit of a juggling act. There's three different balls that we must keep in the air at once. One being our economic growth, our social inclusion, and overall environmental protection. So if one or two of these hit the ground, our juggling act is over. An economy might grow rapidly, for instance, but only for so long if most people remain poor and all the natural resources are used up. Okay, so that was heavy. What can we do? And so I think the power behind all of this, and even in the webinar series itself, is that we're able to leverage our local resources. Because if New Brunswick is one thing, we are resourceful. Sometimes when it comes down to it, we just may not be aware of the resources that are available. So I often encourage you to look out to those and leverage what resources you can. So, looking at, for an example, Food for All New Brunswick's food asset map. So, not even if, say, if you're traveling to a different area or you might be new to an area, what is surrounding you in terms of access to food? Is there grocery stores nearby? Is there a market? Is there other type of programming that I could access? And they have a really great map that they're working to update and keep informed so that everybody has that at their fingertips. We also want to learn where you can access other foods. So think of your food banks, your local grocers, hunting opportunities, local farmers, our community markets, programming like our bulk buy program so that you can stretch your dollar to help support access to healthy fruits and vegetables. And also think of, for families, our school food based programming. So things like subsidized lunch programs, milk programs, backpack options, breakfast, and opportunities for school gardens. The other piece that I do want to mention is that on Food for All New Brunswick, you're able to take action, and they've done that with development of many toolkits. So it's really great to kind of guide the conversation and figure out how many, what the steps are to bringing something like this to your area. Um, and then you rally the troops. So finding those fellow foodies or fellow community assets. I really do think the Community Food Mentor Program is a great way to connect across the province and find resources that are available. And again, like I mentioned, highlight those local programming. So accessing the programs that are available that are on that food asset map, and get creative. Think outside of the box. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do as an individual, but what can we do about it together? So the biggest part is that we need to become more aware and spread the awareness of the importance of food security for all. This can be done by staying up to date and having accurate data. So a lot of the data that I've used today was from Proof, and I've referenced that throughout the presentation. They have great resources for advocacy, and our numbers they tell the tale. So this could be tools that capture relevant information on how many people experience food insecurity and why it is critical for policymakers, public health planners, and advocacy groups to take action. We need to align. So find that alignment opportunity, find their fellow foodies, and work together. We become so passionate often about finding that fast solution to fighting the good food fight that we forget that we can actually go further together. So I encourage you to reach out to those who are passionate about food security and see how you can work together. And again, like I mentioned, a shameless plug for your community food mentor program. There's a plethora of resources and folks that have so many gifts to give, and it's a way to leverage those resources. So, while governments set policies to steer sustainable development, and both the public and private sectors have the major shifts, it requires individual decisions, and that adds up fast. So, your choices to earn a living, move around, make friends, or advocate for justice can make all of the impact. It's not only up to our world leaders, but every person can benefit from a food prosperous, inclusive, resilient world. We can all do something about it, regardless of whether we are in government or civil society, run a business, or we're home, or we're in or out of school. And I always reference this video. I don't know if many of you are Finding Nemo fans, but the part where they are stuck in the net and Nemo just says, keep swimming. And so we needed to have everybody going in the same direction. And so eventually the net breaks because they're all moving in the same direction and they are set free. So sometimes we just have to remember that we're in it together, we're in the net together, and we have every power within us to be able to break the net and break free from food insecurity. The other piece here that I will mention, so um, keeping that conversation moving. Canada has a well established network of social programs that provide support to individuals and families facing many financial hardships. These include social assistant, EI, child and family benefits, and old age pensions. Although it's not designed to protect recipients from food insecurity, a growing body of evidence does suggest that the amount of income provided through these programs is a determinant of the recipient's food insecurity status. So there's a direct line. Whereas most households are reliant on social assistance programs are food insecure, pensioners have the lowest rate of food insecurity in the country, a finding that is explained in part by more adequate and secure incomes provided to pensioners compared to those on welfare. Increases in child benefit programs have reduced the severity of food insecurity seen in families and children. And overall, food insecurity has been shown to drop markedly among low income adults once they become eligible for old age pensions. So it raises the questions of whether a basic income for all Canadians at risk of food insecurity might be a way of ensuring an income floor that would provide enough money for them to be able to meet their basic needs, including access to food. And again, it all comes back is that we simply must just keep swimming. Okay, so thinking back to some of our local resources, um, what we have happening here with ECW's project on Village Indoor Farm that Brian spoke about at the beginning is a prime example. So you'll see their short-term goals outlined to retrofit the former grocery store into a community asset. They were able to leverage that resource to continue partnering with local food banks and food service providers to expand that storage capacity. They were able to find their alignment to share knowledge about indoor farming and food security with community. We're talking food sovereignty and improving access to food deserts. So it's a perfect example of what we've talked about today. Um, and we'll land on the next slide to help us kind of take action in that fight. And this will help us to all keep swimming in that right direction. So I encourage you in the chat to write out and make an action item of what is your commitment to building food security for all. So thinking of what's one thing that you can do in the next day, what's one thing you can do in the next week, and what is one thing that you can do in the next month to help us all keep swimming and move in that right direction. That's all that I have, but I would really love to see some of your thoughts and reflections in the chat, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Karrie, for that very thoughtful presentation. And as people's answers trickle in, we'll start the question and answer period.
Brianna, I love your response in the chat, just overall helping to improve that access. And it scales up from, an individual layer to impacts for the entire community.
Well, I have a few questions actually.
Go for it.
Well, my first one kind of got answered. So I was, I guess, wondering if a bulk buying club would be a suitable solution for an area like Black's Harbor that doesn't have a grocery store, but you kind of touched on that already. Um, I guess one would be, is there a place or in a place like New Brunswick where there's limited transportation, like public transportation, do you find that food deserts become even more problematic? Because I know like almost everyone I know relies on private transportation, and if they didn't have that, and there is no public transportation, I guess I would think that the problem would be kind of even more extreme.
Yeah, great point, and absolutely, and I think that also reflects of, our food security rates in the Maritimes. That's one element of it. We could look at even like our living wage and pieces like that, but we are very rural. It takes a lot of effort to get to where we need to be in our food sources. Like I referenced, they're even further and further away. So I think those efforts of bringing food back to the table that's locally or trying to find, something that's more within reach and improves that access overall would, help in reducing those food deserts that we see and hopefully see that trickle effect.
Thank you. I guess I had another question. So I was kind of looking before the presentation, but do you know if there's anywhere in like Canada or even just New Brunswick that has like local food procurement policies? So like
Mm.
not really mandating, but just that maybe grocery stores have to find a more local option.
I'm not super sure on the whole policy piece, but I will know that in terms of like fast food chains and things like that, for example, there are bylaws in place that many municipalities can enforce in building that healthy environment. So it definitely can happen if there is that, those people swimming in those direction to help make it happen. I went to school in Wolfville, and that was some pieces that we talked about was around just we want to have local restaurants and invest in local businesses that are providing those balanced meals. So it's definitely a possibility.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm seeing lots of great answers in the chat, and I wanted to let everyone know that if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself or you can raise your hand or put the question in the chat and I'll read it. Um, and I have a question. When you talk about just keep swimming and pushing the net, who do you think are the best people to direct those comments and those inquiries towards in terms of legislators?
Yeah, I think just anybody and everybody. So yes, we want to preserve our resources because our volunteerism is tapped right completely. So we want to make sure we're having those conversations and not burning or depleting ourselves in having those. But try to get into those connections that you have or those alignments with others, and then having like for example, I'll use the example of our regional resiliency groups. We have partners from across all tables there, and our whole goal is to be able to kind of, okay, look, Brian, you're doing this over here, I'm doing this over here. This is important. How do we keep moving? And then together, we're able to pool our resources and find what's our next step, and keeping that conversation going. Eventually, people are going to be like, oh my gosh, what's that ruckus in the water? The net snapped, right? And so I think that's where, it seems so overwhelming, but it just starts with those conversations and building those allies. Um, yeah, but I mean, there is some strategy behind it, but I think the more noise we make, we'll get there.
Yeah, more noise, more networking. Yeah,
Networking, I like it.
yeah. I see Brianna raise their hand.
Hi, thanks so much, Karrie. That was such a great presentation. I was wondering actually if you could expand a little bit more on the regional rural resiliency groups. Myself, we're on it down here in
Oh,
Southwest
great.
Brunswick, but maybe a little bit more around like what that role is and how it links directly to food security. Thanks.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've got 15 minutes, so I won't go on too long. But I'm so passionate about it. The work that we're doing is so exciting to see grassroots level of response happening. So basically, there's 12 regions across our province, and we're actually structured under justice and public safety. And so people are often wondering, okay, how does that connect food security? You're a dietitian and you're working for JPS. That makes no sense. But if you think about in times of natural disaster that happened, there's a lot of already current existing issues that arose. So, prime example is food security. Is that people that were already food insecure became even more food insecure along with others during our COVID-19 pandemic. Seniors were more isolated, even though they were isolated prior to the pandemic. So, our goal with regional resiliency is to, I would say it's a really upstream approach to figure out, okay, look, these people, if something does happen, they're going to be really underwater. And how do we prevent that from happening? So each group or each region has a committee that we work with. We invite as many table or people to our table, and we pick out our priorities that we see as a region. So, for example, for myself in Region 11, we've identified 10 priorities that we want to work towards, and knowing that under certain criteria, whether it be food and environment, economic security, stable housing, access to services, um, the more projects and more storm we're making, the better resilience we'll have as a community. Um, yeah, so then basically we offer some level of funding, but really what I say is that the wealth of our group is really in the human resources we're able to gather around the table. So I referenced earlier that oftentimes we just get so stuck up in going through our silos. We just go ahead and we forget about, oh wait, who's all doing this? Maybe we should talk about it and be able to bring our collective impact further. It takes a lot longer process because not everybody is willing to come play around the same table. So we have those conversations and just keep moving that dial. But overall, we've got a great distribution list. We've got a great network of people that we can call on in times of crisis and work towards project that helps support that resiliency of a community.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions so far, so I have another one.
Yeah.
Um, hold on. In the food sovereignty slide, in the section of localizing the food system, you mentioned dumping and inappropriate food aid, but I wasn't really aware of any forms of inappropriate food aid. Could you give some examples or expand on that a little bit?
I guess how I refer to that is sometimes, and I might be off base, but this was my perception. Sometimes we think we're helping, but really we could end up hurting. And so, if a community needs something and we're pulling that resource together and they're really not using it, then is there a benefit? And so, I think it's more or less of addressing the need that a community is expressing and not just assuming or bringing them along in that conversation. Don't know if that helped to answer that
Yeah,
question or not, Brian.
yeah, that makes
Yeah.
perfect sense.
I don't know if you interpret it that way or not. That's how I perceive it as. But yeah, we see that quite a bit, like not necessarily Canada, but if you could think of even like with our First Nations partners and things like that, we have done that in the past. And I think that's where we have to recognize that it's not always the right way.
Hmm,
I
okay,
have another question.
yeah,
So,
go for it.
yeah, so you mentioned that Nunavut has like an extreme rate of household food insecurity compared to the rest of the country, but even compared to the other territories, was there a reason for that, or is it just because like it's so remote and so many islands that it would be more extreme than the other territories?
Yeah, that's my assumption. I really don't know the specific answer on that, but I mean, from the information that we presented today, that you can easily draw assumptions in that. I also don't know kind of around like workplace economic development pieces. So, if what that looks like for many. So, is it are they pulling that income that they need to help provide for themselves and their families? That was another thing that I would consider in that scenario or what local yeah, their local economic picture looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, like I said in the beginning of the webinar, I've just put the webinar registration link in the chat. If you're interested and you haven't registered for the next two, please do and find the link in the chat. Oops,
Brian.
I put the wrong link.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not the right
Whoops.
link.
Whoops. I'm gonna put the right link in the chat now. Floor is still open if there's any last minute questions. Hold on.
And I really do encourage you, like, if there's anything that comes up or you're interested in a project or you hear about it in the next little bit, my contact information's on the CFM website. I'm happy to be that community connector, although I know there's many in your regions as well. So I believe Kim Reeder is our equivalent for um, your region there. She's an excellent community connector. So it's another resource that we can tap into. I'm really excited to also see where the project lands at the indoor farm. So I think that's, really moving the dial there. And it's a great way to improve that access.
Thanks. It's moving along, and I'm hoping by the end of this, the webinar series, I'll be able to do a bonus webinar on the indoor farm and
Awesome.
controlled environment agriculture. So stay tuned for that. And I'll
Perfect.
just say thanks so much, Karrie, for your presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I think we'll wrap it up now.
Thanks, Karrie.
Thanks, everyone.